The New Orleans Conference, the world's greatest investment event.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what to do about what I'm going to talk about right now at my workshop at 5 o'clock. So if anybody is still here at 5 o'clock, come to my workshop. You know, I've been coming to the investment conference in New Orleans for probably more years than I'd like to acknowledge. But I remember being here in 2007. Same time, October, November timeframe, 2007. And the mood at that time, in general, maybe not necessarily at this conference, but in general, in the real world, people were very optimistic about the economy in the fourth quarter of 2007. Now, the fourth quarter of 2007 is when the Great Recession began, right? The worst recession since the Great Depression began in the fourth quarter of 2007, except during the fourth quarter of 2007, nobody knew that we were in a recession. In fact, even the official numbers at the time didn't say we were in recession. The GDP in the fourth quarter of 2007 grew at 2.5%. Doesn't mean, who would think that was a recession? The unemployment rate was not as low, at least the official unemployment rate, as it is today. Right now we're at 3.7, I think we got on Friday. In the last month of 2007, December, the unemployment rate was 4.7, higher than it is now, but it was considered pretty low back then. And of course, the labor force was a lot different. We had a lot more people participating in 2007 than we do today. So it was, we had a lot more people that potentially could be unemployed because a lot more people were still in the labor force. A lot of people have left the labor force, certainly since 2008. And so I think the employment picture actually was better in 2007 than it is today. But the point is, we had low unemployment and GDP growth, and the recession began. Because a lot of people now looking at the stock market beginning to drop, looking at the real estate market, looking at the weakest housing market since 2007, looking at home builders having their biggest collapse since 2007, looking at other indicators, looking at big blue chip bellwether stocks making multi-year lows, the autos, look at General Electric or IBM, or looking at a lot of things that are happening that should be causing people to be nervous, and then they simply rely on the numbers and they say, but the economy is great. I mean, that's almost a foregone conclusion. Even President Trump's critics agree the economy is great. In fact, Barack Obama thinks it's so great, he wants to take credit for it. Nobody thinks that the economy is bad. In fact, confidence right now is the highest it's been since 2000. Of course, consumer confidence was a contrarian indicator back then. Consumers were very confident right before the dot-com bubble burst. They were also very confident in December of 2007, before the financial crisis. They just were not as confident as they are now. And one of the reasons that you have so much confidence today, particularly among small businesses, not just investors, but small businesses, is because small business owners, by and large, are Republican. And Republicans have never been this optimistic. Now, of course, we had 4 years of Barack Obama, or 8 years rather, of Barack Obama, so people were very pessimistic, and it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that we were going to get 4 years of Hillary Clinton. So obviously, going into the election, Republicans were pretty depressed. And so when Trump won, all of a sudden there's this wave of optimism that things are going to get better. And so people think that they're going to get better. But, optimism can be wrong. And normally the consensus is wrong. There's an old saying, I guess it's always darkest before the dawn. I'm not even sure if that's correct, but that's what they say. But the opposite is probably true. And I don't think that that's correct, that it's in nature that it's brightest before dusk. But I think that before you have a collapse, people are extremely optimistic right before the collapse. That's certainly how it was in 2008. Because when you have a bubble, at the top of the bubble, everybody is happy because everybody's made a bunch of money. People were happy in 2000 because they got rich off of .com stocks. So they were happy about that. They didn't realize they were about to lose all that wealth. Same thing happened in the housing bubble. Americans were happy. Homeowners thought they were rich because they had all this home equity, right? So life was good. You didn't have to work. Just own a home and you got rich. So people were optimistic. And of course, when recessions start, unemployment is always low. You can't say we're not going to have a recession because we got low unemployment. Every recession starts with low unemployment. When the recession is over, that's when you have high unemployment, right? Recessions don't start because people lose their jobs. People lose their jobs after the recession begins. Because normally businesses are blindsided. They don't see it coming. They get surprised. And now they have to rearrange their businesses. They have too much capacity. They expanded too much during the boom. They hired too many people during the boom. They made bad decisions during the boom. They don't find out that the decisions were bad until the bust. So you can't look at these statistics and think that we have a good economy. In fact, I remember in 2007, one of the people I used to argue with was Larry Kudlow, and he's now the chief economic advisor to Donald Trump. Now, what was Larry Kudlow saying in 2006, 2007? It was the greatest story never told. It was the Goldilocks economy. He was as bullish as you could possibly be. I remember because, he was bullish to me. I was right there arguing with him. And I actually like Larry Kudlow. He's a nice guy. But he's very partisan, and he can be blind. And if he was so loyal to George Bush, as an anchor on CNBC, imagine how cloudy his judgment is now that Trump has brought him over to the White House. In fact, I remembered that Kudlow was a little bit critical of Trump's trade policies before he was nominated. And people were thinking, oh, now that Kudlow is going to be part of the administration, maybe he's going to move Trump away from protectionism. I said, no, that's not why. I said, Trump appointed him to silence him. He's going to adopt Trump's view of trade, and that's exactly what Kudlow has done, right? He basically took his enemy and brought him under his wing. But you have everybody who just believes that the economy is good. And of course, the cheerleader in chief for the economy being great is Donald Trump himself. Donald Trump, every day, is telling people that this is the greatest economic boom in the history of America. Now, of course, I guess most Americans don't know anything about American history, so maybe they think that's true, right? They don't know anything about the golden age of America, between maybe the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the First World War. But that was unprecedented economic growth. What's going on today isn't even close to what's going on or went on back then. But we're not even doing what we did in the 1980s. This is not even close to the greatest economy ever. In fact, it's very similar to the worst economy ever, according to Trump, which is what we had 2 years ago, right? Because when Donald Trump ran for office, he said we have the worst economy ever. The U.S. was an economic wasteland, that we had squandered our wealth, that we were losing on trade, and all this bad stuff was happening. And I agreed with that, Donald Trump. We had a lot of problems before he was elected. The problem is all those problems are still here. But now Donald Trump is claiming that basically the same economy is now the greatest economy we've ever had, right? He said NAFTA was the worst trade deal ever. Well, now we have the USMCA, the greatest trade deal ever. What's the difference? Basically nothing. The main difference is the name. We used to have a good name, and now we have a stupid name, right? But other than that, it's pretty much the same trade deal. But Trump is saying it's great, right? When Donald Trump was running for office, he said that don't believe the government numbers on unemployment. He said the unemployment rate isn't 4%. It's 20%, it's 30%, it's 40%, right? Why was he saying that? Well, because he was being honest, because we weren't counting a lot of people. We weren't counting all the people who, were working part-time, but who wanted to work full-time. We weren't counting all the discouraged workers who weren't even looking at all because they gave up, right? So if you counted the unemployed properly, the rate would be much higher. I don't know if it would be 40 or 50%. Sometimes Trump would get higher and higher on his numbers. But, the unemployment rate is high. The U6 number, which includes the part-time people looking for full-time jobs and discouraged people, that's up around 7.5%, 8%. I forget the exact amount. But even that doesn't go far enough because it only includes the discouraged workers who have been discouraged for a year or less. So if you've been discouraged for more than a year, then you're not even counted. And of course, the vast majority of discouraged workers have been out of work for a lot longer than a year. So none of these people are counted. But meanwhile, while candidate Trump said the numbers were phony and didn't want to give Barack Obama credit for the low unemployment because he said the numbers were phony, now every time he gives a talk, he's patting himself on the back for having the lowest unemployment ever. And he's pointing to the same statistics that he called phony. And he's saying that we're creating all these jobs. Well, if you go back and get whatever the last 20 months of the Obama administration, we were creating more jobs than we've created for the first 20 months of the Trump administration. There is no significant difference in the job creation that we have under Trump. It's the same as we had under Obama. Now, Trump says we're winning on trade. Really? On Friday, we announced the largest trade deficit with China in history. The trade deficit, I think, is going to be a 10-year high. Last week, we got the merchandise trade deficit. It was the biggest deficit in goods in history. We are bleeding red ink. According to Donald Trump, we are losing on trade. We are losing more now than we were before he was elected. So by what definition are we winning if the trade deficits are bigger than ever? But it's not just the trade deficits that are bigger than ever. It's really the budget deficits, too. I mean, this fiscal year, according to the government, we're going to have like a $1.2 trillion deficit going forward. Last year's was about 700 or 800 billion, except that's only about half the story. You see, the government runs its books, I don't know, kind of like Enron ran its books, but a lot of the expenditures are called off budget, right? And so they don't get officially counted when they tell you what the budget deficit is. And a lot of it is like, disaster relief aid, right? That's an example. Every year we get these hurricanes, the government spends a lot of money. All that is off the books because they say, well, it's an emergency. It's not like something that we should have in the budget, except it happens every year. Maybe it's not the same emergency, but they just don't score it. Right? So if you actually look at how much the national debt went up in the last fiscal year, it went up by about 1.2 trillion, even though officially it only went up by 700 some odd billion. So if the government is now officially forecasting that it's going to borrow on budget 1.2 trillion, the national debt could easily go up by 2 trillion during that time frame. Because that's what you should look at. If you want to know how much money we're borrowing, look at how much the national debt is going up. Because that includes all the money we're borrowing. See, our creditors don't care if it's on budget or off budget. If we borrow the money, it's part of the debt. So we are having record borrowing under Donald Trump. So we have record trade deficits. We have record budget deficits. This is not an economic boom. This is the big, fat, ugly bubble. And that's Donald Trump's words. That's how Donald Trump described the economy he inherited. And the only thing he did was blow more air into that bubble. And in fact, when he was a candidate, he was critical of Janet Yellen for enabling that bubble. He actually said she's keeping interest rates artificially low so that we can inflate this bubble, and it's going to be a disaster when it pops. And he was absolutely right. But you know what he's saying now? Now he's mad at the Fed chairman for raising rates and not keeping them low so the bubble can get bigger. In fact, he's lamenting the fact that he doesn't have 0% interest rates. He wants 0% interest rates so, he can have even more growth. He's saying that, my predecessor was playing with funny money, right? Well, this money is almost as funny, but it's still the bubble, right? He hasn't changed. Trump has not changed anything. Trump campaigned to make America great again. Now he's campaigning to keep America great. It's the same America. What problems has Donald Trump solved? He has created optimism, but it's false optimism. People just think things are going to get better. Now, Trump was able to deliver some tax cuts, right? Well, that's easy. Anybody can cut taxes. Just run up the deficit. But it's not a real tax cut because taxes are how we pay for government. And if you want lower taxes, well, you need less government. So to honestly deliver tax relief to the American public, you need to shrink the size of government. You need to make government less costly, and then you can let the taxpayer off the hook. Hey, we eliminated these departments. We got rid of these agencies. We cut back on this entitlement spending, and now we don't need as much money, so we can cut your taxes. See, but the problem with that is somebody's going to get pissed off because you had to cut some spending. So all that Trump did was cut taxes. Now, of course, the Republican Congress was happy to go along with these tax cuts. They don't give a damn about the deficit. Now, when Obama was president, they were going to shut the country down. They had the whole Tea Party. The Tea Party was born protesting the Obama deficits. The Trump deficits are bigger. And the same guys that were in the Tea Party are now leading the charge to even bigger deficits because the Republicans are happy when the deficits finance the tax cuts that they want to take credit for. And so we did get tax relief, and so there's some optimism that that's somehow going to help the economy. But it doesn't work. It's not magic. Keynesianism doesn't work. You can't just grow the economy by cutting taxes. Because now, where is the government going to get the money that the tax revenue used to provide? Right? There's no free lunch. Right? It works for Republicans too. They like to say that there's no free lunch when the Democrats want to give out money in government programs. Well, there's no free lunch when the Republicans want to give out money in tax cuts. So where is the government going to get the money that it's no longer collecting in taxes? It's going to borrow it. Well, that's just a down payment on a future tax hike. Because who is going to pay back the debt? The taxpayers. The same taxpayers that are getting a cut now are going to get an increase later. But also, those deficits mean interest rates are going up. Now, they were going up anyway, but they're going to go up faster because of the increase in the deficit. And of course, we're going to get more inflation as a result of the larger deficits, because ultimately the Federal Reserve is going to create out of thin air the money that the government is no longer collecting in taxes. So yes, you get a tax cut, but now you have to pay more for groceries, you have to pay more for gas. In fact, one of the statistics that everybody likes to point to show that Donald Trump is doing a great job is that wages are now up year over year by 3.1%. Right? And this is the best wage growth that we've had in about a decade. And Trump is saying, see, look, your wages are going up, right? It's my fault. I did it. But of course, what Donald Trump doesn't want to acknowledge, or anybody else for that matter, is that wages are just one price that's going up. Wages are the price of labor. But the price of everything is going up. Prices are rising. That's a nominal number. When they talk about wages going up, that's not real wages. They don't adjust it for even the government's version of inflation, right? That's just the number. But the cost of living is going up faster than 3.1%. Rents are going up, utility bills are going up, food, everything that you buy, insurance, you name it, the price is going up. Wages are going up too, okay. But you know what? They're not going up as fast as other prices. And so even though nominal wages are rising, real wages are actually falling. So there is nothing to take credit for. Inflation is not a success. In fact, everything that we're seeing is simply an illusion created by inflation. If we actually had a booming economy, like everybody wants to believe, right, we wouldn't be running these big deficits. Booming economies produce surpluses, or at least shrink the deficits. Historically, right, the economy is booming, the government's collecting more in taxes from all these businesses that are booming and all these people who are working. And the government doesn't have to spend as much money on anti-poverty programs. So usually when the economy is good, the deficits are coming down. Instead, the deficits are going up. Same thing with trade. If you really have a booming economy, right, if the economy is really being more productive, if we really were having an industrial renaissance, right, Donald Trump keeps talking about all the manufacturing jobs that are coming back to the country. Of course, none of it is true, but he doesn't stop him from saying it. But if all these industries were really coming back, if America really was the hot place and everybody wanted to be here, and we were producing all this stuff, where is all this stuff? Why aren't we exporting it? Why aren't our imports coming down? If the economy is booming, where is the production that we have to show for this booming economy? It does not exist. That's why the trade deficits are at record highs. So It's not booming economies that produce these big deficits. It's bubbles. Sure, if you borrow a bunch of money and have a party, it feels good, right? The numbers can look good if they are influenced by a bunch of debt. But the problem comes when interest rates go up and the debts come due. And we know from 2008 that that doesn't end well. And as I said in my panel discussion today, right, this bust is going to be so much worse than 2008. I mean, in 2008, the government had the opportunity to do the right thing. George Bush had the opportunity to do the right thing. You know, he said he had to abandon capitalism to save it, right? What we needed to do was embrace capitalism to save it, because it wasn't capitalism that inflated that bubble. It was the government that did that. It was the central banks that did that. It was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So instead of George Bush acknowledging the problems that were created under his administration, which didn't start in his administration, it predated him, it was going on under Clinton, but they tried the stimulus, they did the bailout. I remember John McCain interrupted his campaign so he could vote for the TARP. Of course, if he would have interrupted his campaign to vote against the TARP, I would have voted for John McCain. Instead, I had to vote Libertarian, because I couldn't vote for a Republican that voted for these bailouts. But the Republicans got the blame, and we did truncate that Great Recession. As great as that recession was, it wasn't great enough. It should have been worse, because there were a lot more malinvestments. Housing never really bottomed out, right? The stock market never really flushed out. We never reallocated. The trade deficits never went away. They started. In 2008, mid-2008, we printed the highest trade deficit in history. It took until just this last month to have a bigger one in merchant. We had the highest deficit ever. And the deficit started to come down after the financial crisis. Americans stopped spending. They started saving. That was the beginning of a healthy process that was not allowed to continue because it was interrupted by the Fed, right? You had we were high on cheap money. We come crashing down. We're about to check into monetary rehab, and here comes the Fed with more drugs to make sure that everybody gets out of rehab and still stoned and gets even more wasted. And so this bubble, as I said, what was done under Ben Bernanke, the monetary mistakes made, the excesses, dwarf anything done by Greenspan. You know, even Greenspan, is amazed and is probably almost as bearish as I am right now, except he refuses to accept responsibility for writing the playbook that they're all following, although they've added a lot of chapters that he probably never even envisioned. But they have to keep this thing going. They have to keep the music playing. And so we had interest rates down at 0, and we left them there for 8 years. And now 3 years later of tiny little raises. Of course, only one of those raises took place before Trump was elected. Every other rate hike took place after Trump was elected, right? So, I mean, all these things have been stuck to Trump. I mean, Barack Obama, had a free pass. He got interest rates pretty much at 0 for his entire presidency. And so the number of mistakes that were made were enormous. And a lot of Republicans were right to be fearful of Barack Obama and the things that he would do. But now those same Republicans are optimistic because of Trump. They don't realize that all of the problems that Barack Obama created or that were created during his presidency, they're all still here. Trump has done nothing to defuse that bomb. All he's done is take credit for it, which brings me to the bigger problem. This is now the Trump economy. This is now the Trump stock market. I mean, it's like there's a giant T on there, like it's one of his buildings, right? And instead of telling the truth to the American public, he's feeding them lies, the same type of lies that they were fed in the past, and which is why he was elected, because he told the truth about how lousy things were and that he was going to make it better. Well, he didn't make it better. He allowed it to get worse while claiming that he made it better. And so when it all falls apart, in the next couple of years, which it easily could do, right? Because when I start off this talk by talking about 2007, this reminds me so much of 2007. The only difference is now there's more warning signs of an imminent crisis than there was then. But it's the same people who are completely oblivious to it. And when it happens, they're going to say nobody could have seen it coming. even though it's pretty obvious. And they'll dismiss me because they'll say, well, you've been saying it for years, which is true. I have, because the problems have been building for years, right? In fact, because they've been building for years, they got a lot bigger. Had we done the right thing in 2008 and let the recession run its course, let a lot of these big banks fail, right? Let more people lose money, force the government to cut spending, force the government to deal with entitlements. I mean, look at Donald Trump. Why is we're never going to cut, according to Trump, we're never going to cut Social Security. We're never going to cut Medicare, right? Not only did Trump cut taxes, he increased spending. He increased welfare spending. He increased warfare spending, right? More money on the military. And now, as if the military wasn't big enough, he wants to have a space force. Where's that money going to come from? Talk about, I mean, we borrowed a lot of money in the 1960s to go to the moon. We didn't have that money. We ran, all the inflation of the 1970s was a byproduct of the money we printed in the 1960s. We ran the big deficits back then. We had the guns and butter economy. But now we want more guns and more butter, except we're more broke. We were a lot sounder. In the 1960s, we were the world's biggest creditor nation. We were running trade surpluses in the 1960s. I mean, we're a shadow of our former self. Not only are we the world's biggest debtor, we owe more money than all the other debtor nations of the world combined. And the thing that's been keeping us out of crisis has been that interest rates were ridiculously low. That enabled us to borrow way more money than we can ever repay and pretend that we could service it because rates were low. Well, rates are not ultra low anymore. They're still low, but they ain't low enough, right? If you have a gigantic heroin habit and all of a sudden you're not getting quite as much heroin as you used to get, that's a problem because you have a tolerance. You're accustomed to a certain amount. Rates are at 2%, and the economy is hemorrhaging, right? The housing market, the auto market, and they're still 2%. And people are thinking, well, we're just bringing rates back to normal. Why should that be a problem? Well, because we don't have a normal amount of debt. We have an abnormal amount of debt. The government, and not just the federal government with the $21.5, almost $22 trillion national debt now, but you've got all the states that have been loading up on debt while money was cheap. The municipalities have borrowed a lot of money. Corporations have borrowed a ton of money. What do they do with it? They bought back their overpriced stocks. Kids have borrowed a lot of money. We have $1.5 trillion in student loans. What do they get for that? Nothing, right? I mean, in theory, they have a diploma, but what's that worth? Not much. We have record auto debt. We have record credit card debt, right? What do we have to show for that? Depreciated stuff, right? So everybody is loaded up on debt, and we pretend that we have a great economy because we're spending borrowed money to buy stuff we can't afford. Well, this crisis is going to be the last one because the last two times that the bubbles burst, the Fed was able to blow a bigger one and postpone the pain. And, if you just wrote it out, if you didn't sell your stock portfolio in 2009, well, you're back, you're ahead again, right? If you didn't sell your house in some markets, real estate prices are actually higher than they were before the last bubble popped. Not true for all markets, but some markets, you had a complete reflation of the bubble. But then we blew up bubbles in just about everything. But this last time, right, it's not going to be the third time is the charm for the Fed. It's going to be 3 strikes and you're out. This bubble is too big to reflate. Right? If we are running $1.2 trillion deficits, closer to $2 trillion, in good times, right, when the economy is supposedly growing, and we're at peace, we're not at war right now. Imagine the size of the deficits during the next recession, because we're going to have one. I mean, we're long overdue. This is the second longest expansion ever. Of course, it's required more stimulus than any prior expansion in history, and it's going to give way to the biggest bust. But when this recession starts, the deficits are going to skyrocket. They're going to be $3 trillion or more per year, right? I mean, the national debt doubled under Bush, then it doubled again under Obama. It's going to double again in the next 8 years, right? At least. And that is enormous amount of borrowing in this next recession. Where's that money going to come from? Right now, everybody thinks the Fed's going to keep raising rates. Everybody thinks the Fed's going to shrink their balance sheet. Everybody is wrong. The Fed's going to have to reverse course and go back down to zero. The only question is when. Are they going to wait for everything to collapse and then go? Or are they going to kind of try to read their tea leaves and maybe try to front run the collapse? I don't know. I mean, they were totally wrong in 2008. They had no idea that they were about to get blindsided. But either way, rates are going back to zero. The Fed's going to do QE4. There's nothing else that they can do. And then, the pretense is going to be over. People are going to know that this is a permanent, monetary fiscal policy, that we're never going to normalize rates, that we're never going to shrink the balance sheet, and the dollar is going to fall through the floor. Right now, the dollar's had this big rally based on everybody believing that there's a successful unwind, a successful conclusion to this policy. That's premature. Anybody can get drunk. Anybody can, get hooked on drugs. It's kicking the habit. That's the hard part. Well, this is the impossible part. And when the markets figure that out, everybody that's been betting on the dollar is going to get out. People are going to buy gold, and interest rates are going to rise. That is going to be really the biggest problem. We haven't had a recession since the 1970s where interest rates went up, not down. The government was always able to fend off recessions by lowering interest rates. And that was kind of like a shock absorber. Even though people lost their jobs, the economy slowed down, at least interest rates went down, and it made it easier for us to borrow more money and to service our debt. Well, the next time the bond market is going to be the epicenter of the crisis, long-term interest rates are going up. I don't care how much money the Fed prints to try to influence the market, rates are going to go up anyway. And so it's going to be stagflation. We're going to have recession, not just stagnation, but actual recession, a contracting economy as interest rates rise, as inflation rises, and ultimately the dollar is going to lose its status as the reserve currency. That is the writing that's on the wall. You can see that now. You can see foreigners already starting to front run this trade. The appetite for US dollars is waning, and we're actually accelerating that curve. Donald Trump is actually antagonizing all of our bankers, all the people that are loaning us money and supplying us with merchandise. He's vilifying them. We've got these tariffs, the trade wars. Trump keeps saying we're going to punish China with tariffs. China doesn't pay these tariffs. It's the Americans that pay the tariffs. They're taxes on American consumers who buy imported products, right? So if the tax cuts were supposedly good, why are these tax hikes also good? But all this is going to backfire. Oh, am I over my time? Yeah, so all this is going to backfire, which brings me to the conclusion of this talk, and I will continue it at my workshop, because the important thing is going to be, how do you prepare for this? Because there's nothing we can do. We can all vote next week, and it's not going to matter who we vote for, because A, it's not going to affect the election. But I do think that there's a good chance that we are going to have a socialist Congress and a socialist president in 2020, because Trump and the free market are going to take the blame for this collapse, just like the free market and Bush got blamed for the last collapse. Everybody's going to say, or everyone's going to agree, that Trump inherited a pristine economy and blew it. And because he made the mistake of claiming credit for this bubble and saying everything was good, when it all falls apart, he's going to be stuck with the blame. And the socialists are going to throw gasoline on the fire. And so things are going to get very, very bad. The only chance we're going to have to turn things around is going to be 2024, when things are so bad that maybe we can make a turn for the right direction. But in the meantime, a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money. But the people at my workshop are going to make some money. So I hope I see you there. Bye.